Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm Erin Collinson, Director of Policy Outreach here at CGD. And I'm really excited about the conversation we have teed up for you this morning on the metrics that USAID has selected as part of its new strategic approach to development centered on its vision for helping countries progress along their journey to self-reliance. I'm going to very quickly outline our program, and then we'll go ahead and get started. To begin, we're going to hear opening remarks about the agency's ambitions for assisting countries in their journeys to self-reliance from Susan Fine, Acting Assistant to the Administrator for USAID's Bureau for Policy, Planning, and Learning. Once Susan is finished, I'm going to invite Chris Maloney, a Senior Advisor at USAID, up here to share the metrics the agency has selected and talk about how they will and won't be used. And after his presentation, Chris will sit down, and I'm going to have Brad Parks, Executive Director of Aid Data at the College of William and Mary, and my CGD colleague, Sarah Rose. All three of them have had past experience working on this sort of country-level development data in the U.S. government. They're going to join me on stage, and I'm going to have a chance to ask them a few questions. Then we'll bring Susan back up, and we'll turn to you all for questions at that point. So with that, I want to introduce Susan Fine. As I mentioned, Susan is the Acting Assistant to the Administrator for PPL. Senior Foreign Service Officer, Susan has had a distinguished career with USAID, holding a number of key positions here in Washington as well as overseas, including Mission Director for Senegal. And I understand that as USAID has undertaken the process of defining its new approach consistent with the concept of the journey to self-reliance, Susan has really taken on a role of senior leader and champion at the agency alongside her colleague, Margot Ellis. So please help me welcome Susan Fine.
Thank you very much, Erin, and good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for coming here, for your interest in this event. So I am very excited to be here with my colleagues to officially unveil version 1.0 of USAID's self-reliance metrics. For the past 9 months plus, we at USAID, a number of people at USAID have been working to develop these self-reliance metrics based on instructions from Administrator Green. And it has been quite an effort, and it's also been a very inclusive process. But I would say that I think for those of us who've been involved in it, this is really we're really happy to be at the point where we can say, okay, yes, we officially have the set of metrics that we've selected. We can share them publicly. And so we're very happy to have this opportunity to unveil them here today with you and then have a conversation about it. As we've heard Administrator Green say many times, the ultimate goal of foreign assistance must be to work towards the day that foreign assistance is no longer necessary, and we must measure our work by how far every investment moves us closer to that day. At the heart of this vision and of USAID's transformation is the core belief that each country must lead its own development journey and finance and implement solutions to its development challenges. The Administrator affirmed this vision during the recent 50th annual Tidewater Meeting of Development Ministers, which was held in St. Michael's, Maryland last week. And while Tidewater is an off-the-record meeting, I can tell you that the Administrator used the meeting as an opportunity to outline his vision for self-reliance, the concept of the journey to self-reliance, and seek feedback on this from many of our development partners who are members of the Development Assistance Committee, the DAC. Many DAC members felt that the journey to self-reliance resonates both as a framework for how to think about strategy and programming, as well as a narrative for communicating with their domestic constituencies about foreign assistance. And while there were certainly some questions and some concerns, all Tidewater participants left the meeting keen to stay engaged as USAID continues to roll out the journey to self-reliance. So in addition to rolling it out with all the partners and stakeholders who are represented here, we're also rolling it out with our donor partners. And so this is why we're here today, to discuss these self-reliance metrics as an important first step to help achieve the vision of the journey to self-reliance. The metrics will help us better understand with data where each country stands on its development journey so that we can tailor our strategies and programs based on country needs. In so doing, this will help ensure that the partnerships we have with each country and the types of programs we implement are oriented towards better supporting that country's ability to manage its own development. As someone who has spent much of my career in the field, I'm excited about this country-centric approach. For the past decade, USAID has focused largely on addressing global development challenges. Sometimes that made it difficult to tackle the issues that were most important in a particular country. So the self-reliance metrics have a key role in making this shift. They are transparent, and we believe that they will stimulate crucial conversations with missions, in embassy country teams, and with host country counterparts and development partners about where countries can advance and what is holding back their development progress. I also want to emphasize that many of you here, as USAID employees, external partners, both in Washington and around the world, made valuable contributions to the selection of the metrics. It is, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been a very inclusive and iterative process. We've had more than 100 engagements across the agency. We've also met with many external stakeholders, including the Center for Global Development. We've had fantastic input from the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid, from people on the Hill, with development partners and throughout the interagency. And we have taken the feedback on board and integrated it. I hope you will see that in what will be presented here today. So, therefore, I feel that the metrics that we are unveiling today have been rigorously tested, and I am confident that they are sound and that they will serve their intended purpose. So I'm looking forward to the discussion amongst the panelists and with all of you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Erin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. So now we're going to get a PowerPoint presentation loaded up on the screen here, and I'm going to invite Chris Maloney to come up here. Chris is a Senior Advisor for Strategic Metrics and Deputy Coordinator for Outcome 1 on USAID's Transformation Task Team. He joined USAID in January after 5 years at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where he managed the agency's annual country selection process, as well as issues related to country eligibility and monitoring. Let's welcome Chris Maloney.
Thank you. Can I first just say how exciting it is to see on a Wednesday morning this much interest in something as wonky as metrics. So thank you, everybody, for coming out. So I'm going to take about 10 minutes. I'm a former management consultant, so you're going to have to bear with me. If I don't have some slides, I just don't know how to talk. So I promise, though, they'll be short and sweet. But I want to talk about two things. The first is, what do we actually mean by the idea of self-reliance? I'll be the first to admit that's a little bit of a highfalutin term. So let me sort of bring it down to reality and really talk about what do we mean by the idea of self-reliance and why do we care? Then I'm going to double click a little bit on one of the key ways, as Susan alluded to how we're going to operationalize this idea of self-reliance, which is talking about these metrics and specifically why we've landed on them and how we're going to use them, but it's just as importantly how we're not going to use them. So let's dig in. So, what is self-reliance? The idea emanates directly from the administrator's vision, which is ending the need for foreign assistance. But if we're to end the need for foreign assistance, we need to be able to understand a really important thing, which is for each of our partner countries, how able are they to plan, finance, and implement solutions to solve their own development challenges? For some countries, that's maybe 5 years away. For other countries, it could be 50 or even 100 years away. But we need to be able to understand where each of our countries are at in this ability to plan, finance, and implement solutions to solve their own development challenges. And so that at its core is shorthand for how we're trying to talk about the idea of self-reliance. It really is this understanding of where our countries are at. Now, for my fellow development wonks in the room, I think one of the things that why this may not sound necessarily that unique or that different is that this is in some ways a more nuanced way of talking about the development spectrum. This recognition that if you're Somalia or if you're Georgia, what you do in these countries is completely different. And so that, I think, is what makes this idea different for us at AID, is that we want to shift now to meeting our countries where we're at and ensuring that what we do in our countries is ultimately strengthening its ability to plan, finance, and implement solutions to solve its own challenges. In other words, we want to be able to strengthen self-reliance in all of our partner countries. So what actually drives self-reliance? Over the past 9 months, we've spent a lot of time really thinking hard about, okay, what determines this idea? And really, there are two sides of this. In some sense, an input and an output. So the first piece is what I call commitment. These are looking at the choices, the behaviors, the informal governance mechanisms that you see in a partner country. For those of you who are familiar with MCC, the bulk of the indicators on the MCC scorecard fall into this bucket. This is the idea of the choices that you see in a country that enable it to move along its development journey. But on the flip side, you also have to understand where a country is at already along the development spectrum, and this is what we mean by capacity. Looking at how far the country has come across political, social, and economic aspects of its society and its ability to work across those sectors to drive its journey. And there is a bit of an interplay here, right? So if I make challenging policy choices, that could impact my capacity, but at the same time, if I'm at low capacity, my ability sometimes to make right policy choices is also challenging. So there is an interplay. But ultimately, the theory of change is that as a country's commitment and capacity increase, so should the overall level of self-reliance. And where are we going with this as an agency? So there's a lot going on in this chart, so I'm going to try and keep this simple. But the first thing is this metrics effort, which we're going to talk about today. The first is this project here where we're trying to understand, is there a way to actually plot the journey to self-reliance, to actually plot the development spectrum the way that we're defining it? And so we're looking for metrics that can help us measure commitment and metrics that can help us measure capacity. And so that is what the metrics project is all about, trying to be able to turn those dots into actual countries and be able to show the journey to self-reliance. The second is then, once we're able to understand where countries are in their journey, what is it that we can do as an agency to catalyze countries along that journey? And while there are many levers you could pull, there are two that are at the core of the administrator's vision. The first is this idea of financing self-reliance. So all of the things that we as an agency can do to help a country actually finance its development journey. So this is more than just domestic resource mobilization. This is looking at transparency and accountability. This is looking at the enabling environment for capital. This is looking at financial markets and their relative level of sophistication. It's looking at public financial management. It's looking at all of these things, breaking down these silos and really trying to transform how we as an agency can work on this critical piece of the story. It's also looking at the private sector enabling environment side, making sure that no matter where a country is along the spectrum, have we really thought through the range of collaboration and other market-based solutions that we can do with the private sector to drive sustainable investment. That's what we have on this catalyzer side, but then we also need to think a little bit about what we're doing inside our building. So there's a project also going on looking at the incentives we have for ourselves and for our host country partners in terms of defining a focus on self-reliance. So we want to make sure that the way we define our relationships is truly focused on this idea of self-reliance. This last project is one that I sometimes think is the misunderstood. And the idea here is that if we're able to plot the spectrum in this way, if we're able to plot the journey to self-reliance in this way, clearly there are currently some partner countries who are already highly self-reliant. And so if we have a highly self-reliant partner, we want to ask the question, what does this mean? Is the nature of the partnership, the traditional grant-beneficiary relationship, the right model for such a country? And so this project is going to do two things. The first is trying to create a transparent rubric using the metrics, but also using qualitative information to identify transparently, not in a black box, who our most self-reliant countries are. And then trying to identify a typology of the set of different types of partnerships that could be out there for that type of a country. And that could mean a very different footprint. It could mean no change at all. My guess, though, is that most of these partnerships are going to be somewhere in between those two sides of the spectrum. But we want to be able to have a transparent approach to defining how we think about an evolved partnership beyond the traditional model. And that's what strategic transition is all about. So now let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about the metrics, and then we'll have the whole panel to go deep into all of this. But when we talk about the metrics, what are we trying to measure? As I said at the beginning, we want to find a way to measure commitment and capacity. And we started first by looking at the three pieces of any country diagnostic that you're looking at. You want to look at the government, you want to look at the people, and you want to look at the economy. Now, this is not because we're biased for MCC, where we have, of course, investing in people, economic freedom, and ruling justly, but there is certainly informing how we were thinking about the three prongs of any society. But then we wanted to get a little bit sharper in terms of what concepts we're actually trying to look at under each of these pieces. And so you'll see we defined in the commitment side, we want to look at open and accountable government. We want to look at inclusive development. We want to look at economic policy choices. And when we think about this more capacity, this more how far along are you in the spectrum side, we want to look at the capacity of the government. We thought it important to separate out civil society because we want to look at the capacity of civil society. Then, of course, of the citizens, then finally of the nature, the structure of the economy itself. As Susan alluded to, we've had over 9 months of consultations and a lot of work looking at over 200 different data sets. And today, we have finally settled on what we're calling our V1.0 list of 17 metrics, a manageable set of metrics that we think can help us plot the journey to self-reliance. So without further ado, here they are. I see many people taking pictures, many people wanting to write this down furiously. We have a website that has gone live today, so if you want to look at all of this, it's usaid.gov/self-reliance, one word, no hyphen. But it is up there if you want to dig deep into all these metrics, look at the hyperlinks, where they come from. But at the end of the day, you will see here a range of different indicator institutions. All of them, similar to the MCC scorecard, are third party. You can access them. None of them are in a black box. They all show, again, different sides of this story. So if we look at open accountable governments, we're looking at democracy. We're looking at open government questions. If we're looking at inclusive development, we're looking at social group equality, which is mixing into there a whole lot of issues around regional disparities, gender disparities, ethnic disparities, religious disparities, a whole range of different questions that might aggregate up into broader social group equality questions. The economic gender gap. Economic policy, we're basically looking at the private sector's enabling environment, trade choices, and then resource management choices. On the capacity side, again, I don't need to belabor this, you can all read this, but again, looking at service delivery, resource mobilization, and rule of law issues for the government side. Capacity of civil society, we're looking at the range of mechanisms available for civil society to hold its government to account. For capacity of citizens, we're looking at health, education, and poverty. And for the economy, we're looking at its structure, we're looking at income, and we're looking at sort of technological readiness. These are all very high-level indicators, and I will be the first person to say that they are not perfect, but we do think that for a V1.0 to start us along our own journey to figuring out the journey to self-reliance, this is a great place to start. When we work on the math, when we look at the statistics and the data behind this, it is showing us what we want to see roughly, and at the end of the day, provide a great entry point, not the deterministic or dogmatic be-all, end-all, but an entry point for thinking through how we want to think about a picture of a country from a self-reliance standpoint. Where are we going with this? I'm just going down here so you can see this very well. Okay, you can sort of see this. Where are we going with this is we want to create something called a country roadmap. We want to take these indicators to show a country's actual self-reliance profile. And so over the summer, we're going to start creating these, and we anticipate launching these in the fall on a portal, another self-reliance portal that you can see, where we'll show that scatter plot and where the country sits. And then you can see the relative strengths and relative obstacles for a country along those 17 metrics that I just showed you. We've normalized all of them on a 0 to 1 scale so that you can easily eyeball them. Of course, there are some trade-offs in doing that, but we think this is good enough for showing us a high-level view of a country. And we've shown where other low and middle-income countries sit, so you can see some of the distributional issues of how that works out. But ultimately, we want to be able to see how far a country is along both the overall journey and then what I'm sort of calling these sub-journeys on each of these 17 metrics. On the back of these roadmaps, you'll then also be able to see, just like you can see on our website right now, the actual indicators, the definitions, and their hyperlinks. So finally, I'm going to end before we sort of move to the panel by talking importantly about what these are going to be for and not for. So at the end of the day, these metrics and these roadmaps, where we're going with these, are only going to be used for 4 purposes. The first is trying to see where a country is at in its development journey. And that may not sound like much, but we think it's pretty exciting to put this level of rigor, for lack of a better way to phrase it, in plotting the development spectrum and plotting the journey to self-reliance. And we think that's exciting. And so we think it's important to sort of have that stake in the ground about how we want to reorient and think about this concept of self-reliance and this country-anchored view. We think that these can be important tools when appropriate for development dialogue with our country partners, with our implementing partners, with civil society, with other stakeholders who are trying to understand how we can move countries along the journey to self-reliance. We think this would be an important and critical way for informing our country strategies. And in fact, we're starting to pilot this with a few countries to see how well this works or doesn't work, where the tripwires are, to basically help ensure that what we are doing in our countries at the highest level is focused as much as possible on moving the country along this journey to self-reliance. And finally, as I said before, these metrics will also be used to help us identify countries where we might want to think about a strategic transition of the partnership in some form, potentially. Not by himself, the metrics will not be deterministic or dogmatic, but they will be a key way of informing us where we want to look more closely. And finally, what will this not be used for? As you've noticed, they are all a dull blue, these roadmaps. That's on purpose. There's no reds or greens, there's no rankings, there's no hard hurdles. These are not MCC scorecards. These are meant to be a tool for us to see the country relative to all other low and middle income countries, and that's really it. There's no competitive nature to this. There's no expectation that you should be moving from A to B necessarily over time. It's more that, are we doing the right things in terms of how that country's journey is progressing, or not progressing, as the case may be. As I've alluded to, these are not meant to be infallible. Again, I will be the first to say these roadmaps at best are painting the picture of a country from a year and a half ago. There are data lags. There are plenty of missing issues. The data themselves are not perfect. There are data gaps. We will need to use secondary metrics, secondary analyses, qualitative analyses to truly pull a country's self-reliance picture into focus. But as I said before, we do think these metrics nonetheless are a great entry point. And then finally, these are not going to be program indicators. There's no way that we can expect X million dollars in this area is going to move something as high level as any of these 17 metrics. But again, they are an important entry point. So with that, let me end and start our panel.
So Chris is going to sit down. I'm going to ask Brad Parks and Sarah Rose to join us up here. So Brad Parks is Executive Director of Aid Data and a member of the research faculty at the Institute for the Theory and Practice of International Relations at the College of William & Mary. Brad's research focuses on aid allocation and impact, among other subjects, which makes him a valuable and logical addition to the panel. And we're also big fans of the work that Aid Data does, so we're very pleased Brad could join us today. And finally, Sarah Rose, I'm going to sit down, is a policy fellow here at CGD. Late last year, Sarah was the lead author on a paper that looked at USAID and smart strategic transition that offered a number of suggestions for how the agency could use, in particular, quantitative indicators to sort of add to its decision-making when it comes to country partnerships. And she also served on the working group that Susan had referred to on that was convened by USAID's Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid. So, really glad. So since Chris just had the floor, I'm going to go ahead and go to Sarah and Brad first. And Sarah, I'd like to start with your sort of initial reaction to what Chris presented, but I'd also love if you can kind of take us a step back by outlining some of the merits and challenges to using this sort of data and these quantitative indicators to help inform decision-making and development.
Sure, thanks a lot. As Erin pointed out, I had the privilege of being able to watch this process unfold and evolve over the last several months as a participant on the advisory committee working group. And I think I can say very honestly that it is a testament to the hard work of Susan, of Margot Ellis, of Chris, and many, many other people within USAID as well as outside of USAID who gave important input and feedback into this process, that they have really landed on a product that is a defensible set of indicators to look broadly at what they think is what the U.S. government should think is important to consider in terms of development, and a smart framework for how to use them. The reason this is so important is that this is a really major undertaking. As Erin mentioned, there are certainly merits to using this kind of a cross-country indicator kind of system for evaluating where countries are on their development journey. But there are also a lot of challenges associated with these kinds of indicators, and being able to put forth a framework that is sensitive to those limitations, I think, is really important. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those. And so I think the merits have been touched on briefly. Is that I think first of all, using data when you have it is always preferable to over-relying on assumptions for how things are in a particular place. And not only that, it adds an element of transparency, credibility, accountability to the whole decision-making process. It allows insight into the kinds of decisions that are being made by USAID, and it offers opportunity for both local stakeholders as well as stakeholders here in the United States to ask smart questions about why decisions are being made by USAID as well. That said, there are certainly challenges that are associated with these kinds of cross-country indicators. Chris mentioned a couple of them very briefly, but they're really important, I think, to understand in terms of how we should expect this tool to be used by USAID going forward. So the first is that no set of cross-country indicators that anyone could ever put together anywhere is going to measure everything you possibly want to know about a country's development. USAID could have put together a list of all 200 data sets that they said they reviewed, and which would not be advisable. And they still wouldn't have come up with a complete picture of everything you want to know about development. I mean, think about capacity, for instance. I mean, I think that USAID has chosen capacity as a particular category that they seek to look at, truly recognizes that capacity is a very important thing to be considering when you're thinking about where a country is and its development trajectory. But there is not an indicator around that's going to get at the specific capacities of particular institutions to actually design and implement reforms, much less recognize that capacity varies very much by sector, within sectors, across localities, et cetera. The second thing I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of limitations is that there are always going to be trade-offs between narrowness but also legibility and actionability. So does a country measure something very specific, like how bribes you have to give to police or something like that, versus something that's broad and comprehensive and captures a lot of what you might want to think about in a development sense, but is also much more opaque and hard to get your head around. And I think it seems like in a lot of cases, when you're trying to measure a breadth of things, usually the focus is on the latter, and that can be sometimes a little bit difficult to understand what exactly it is an indicator like government effectiveness is seeking to put forth. There's also an issue in terms of, this is a snapshot, right? This is a snapshot in time of where a country's development performance is. It doesn't tell you anything about past trends, and despite the name roadmap, it doesn't tell you anything about future trajectory. What it is really if you want to keep along the lines of a trip, a journey, it's coordinates of where a country was a couple of years ago, quite honestly, because there's always a data lag associated with some of these indicators. Poverty indicators can be up to 10 years old, but most of them are only lagged by a year or two. And so what I think, I've just gone through a number of limitations here. But the reason why I think that what USAID has put forth today is smart, is reasonable, is defensible, is because the way they are presenting it is very sensitive to these limitations. They have come forth with, broadly a group of things that I think are important to pay attention to in terms of, thinking about a country's development progress. And they are not using it prescriptively. They are relying on the importance of a lot of supplemental information, secondary data sets, secondary analyses, qualitative, quantitative, et cetera, that will go into the conversations about what a country strategy should look like, whether or not a country is ready for a different kind of partnership, for instance. When there are very high stakes associated with indicators, when a country's performance at a certain level prescribes a policy action on the part of the government, the particular selection of indicator matters enormously. But this is not that kind of situation. These are fairly low stakes. This is going to be a quantitative tool to inform decisions that USAID wants to make broadly. And because of that, I think it is a very smart way to put this forth. I think some of the challenges going forward will be ensuring that everybody who uses this tool across the agency in developing strategies, in having conversations with partner country governments, in thinking about readiness for certain next steps, also utilizes it with a keen focus on some of the limitations as well. And that will be something that is socialized over time, I think, among the agency as well. So.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So Brad, would welcome your perspective on what Chris presented as well. And since I know you've done a lot of research over the years on how donors like USAID engage with partner countries, and in particular how they seek to shape or inform their development priorities, would love to hear your thoughts on how those country roadmaps that Chris described might factor into that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, the timing of this event is perfect because I just finished a 7-year-long study with a student named Caroline Davis looking at the empirical scale and scope of the MCC's incentive effect and trying to basically understand in which countries did the incentive effect work and why and how. And what we found was about a third of the candidate countries, so I think 42 or 43 countries, they responded between 2004 and 2010 by appointing or assigning a team of government officials to address the performance issues that were raised in the MCC scorecards. And for virtually all of these teams, the very first step that they took was to enter into a dialogue with the MCC, with the State Department, with the third-party indicator institutions. So that may sound good at first blush, But the MCC was initially caught flat-footed when these government officials showed up at their doorsteps with a long list of questions, to Sarah's point, about how they could improve their indicator performance. And likewise, the US government's kind of frontline representatives and diplomatic posts all around the world were not particularly well prepared to answer a lot of these questions, which led to some missteps and led to some missed opportunities. And the indicator institutions themselves, they were not very ready to provide practical, actionable policy guidance to the government officials that were coming to them with lots of questions, which led to frustration. And in some cases, a small minority of cases, it led to broader diplomatic blowback for the US government outside the confines of the aid relationship. So there's a note of caution, I guess, from the early experience with the MCC. I think a key lesson was, you can't just throw up some assessments of other countries' performance on a US government website, provide little or no guidance on how countries can improve their performance, and expect this not to at least stress and potentially even roil your bilateral relationships. So what does this mean? USAID, in my view, needs to be ready for the day after publication, right? They need to anticipate and be ready to answer the questions and requests for policy guidance that are coming its way. And if past is prologue, I think USAID should be making some special preparations to ensure that they're ready to answer very specific questions about why countries perform the way that they do on the more black box indices and perception-based measures like horizontal accountability or government effectiveness. These government officials are going to be struggling to unpack and diagnose their performance. And there is a risk that in the absence of guidance, that government effort can be misdirected in sort of inefficient or distortionary ways. So let me just share a brief example with you all. So back in the summer of 2013, there were dozens of billboards that mysteriously popped up in a West African capital. I won't name the West African country. And all of these billboards were advertising the damaging effects of corruption. And enterprising journalist from The Economist wanted to know what was motivating the authorities to pursue this public awareness campaign. And he did some investigative journalism and found that the authorities were trying to improve their performance on the anti-corruption metric that the MCC uses to make MCC eligibility determinations. So you might wonder, right, why would the authorities choose to pursue a public awareness campaign when there is literally like zero evidence that telling people that corruption is bad is going to have any effect on corruption? And the answer is simple, and I think it should also be sobering for all of us. The authorities, they were sort of casting about, looking for solutions to their corruption performance problem. When they went to MCC and they went to the indicator institutions, they didn't get a lot of specifics. And so what did they resort to? They resorted to a very broad and very visible policy intervention that they thought might change public perceptions, because they were told this indicator largely measures corruption perceptions. I consider this to be a cautionary tale, right? Because telling people that corruption is bad is almost certainly not where USAID itself or the broader US government thought that the authorities in this country should have been concentrating their attention and effort. But this is not the kind of thing, but this is the kind of thing that can happen when you publish metrics that aren't tied to actionable policy guidance. So I think the point here is that USAID needs to be really clear-eyed about the sort of iron law of unintended consequences, right? And I think one thing that USAID can do to get out in front of this issue would be to start working with the indicator institutions between now and when the country scorecards or the country roadmaps are released, to come up with concrete examples of how other countries have improved their performance on these 17 indicators. How have they empirically moved the needle? Just to help countries kind of get their minds around what is a worthwhile intervention. And then I'll just want to make one more quick point, and that is, I think that we have to be, USAID ought to be very careful about tunnel vision once the roadmaps start being published on a routine basis. So Ambassador Green has been very clear from the get-go. I think it was on Chris's first slide. The strategic vision is that USAID ought to be an agency that's focused on ending its need to exist. But I think the agency is going to have to make a pretty concerted effort to make sure that the sort of main thing remains the main thing. And what I mean by that is the 17 metrics that AID has selected, as Sarah said, they're reasonable, they're defensible, but ultimately they are indirect and imperfect proxies for where countries are on that journey towards self-reliance. So if we take Ambassador Green's strategic vision at face value, the agency's main goal should be to wean countries off of foreign assistance so that they can independently plan, finance, and manage their own development efforts. So it seems reasonable to me that we should expect USAID to publicly report on how countries are progressing towards the end goal. That is, whether and to what extent USAID partner countries are actually becoming less dependent on foreign assistance. If reducing aid dependence is the main thing, then we should make it the main thing. So I guess my modest suggestion would be, I'm not suggesting an 18th indicator, but I think there could be a sort of standalone or set-aside box in the country roadmaps to tell us something about the end goal, right? You characterized, Chris, the commitment and capacity indicators as drivers of an outcome. The outcome is weaning countries off their need to rely on foreign assistance. So telling countries and other external stakeholders where we are on that journey, I think would be valuable just to make sure that we don't lose sight of where we're driving the car, right? What the end goal is. And then I'll just very briefly say, I've talked to some of you about this before, but I think that it would be in USAID's best interests to pursue a robust learning agenda around these indicators and how they relate to the journey to self-reliance, right? So if this framework is going to stand the test of time, the agency's eventually going to need to account for the relationship between the indicators that are selected and AID's stated objective of ending its need to exist. So now's the time to get out in front of this issue and start doing research inside USAID, commissioning research on how progress against the roadmap metrics relates to changing levels of aid dependence and self-reliance. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great, Brad. Thanks. And I see Chris is taking notes. I feel like he's gotten a lot of information, and I know he was nodding his head through a lot of it too, so that's good. So I wanted to ask, you landed on these sort of 17 self-reliance metrics. We've already heard, I think, from everyone that, we understand these are not infallible. Any set of metrics you pick, there's going to be challenges to using it. And I think, there are undoubtedly people in the audience today who are wondering why you chose indicator X over indicator Y. I'm not suggesting we litigate that here, but I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about the process of reaching this set of metrics. So, you mentioned the 200 or almost 200 data sets. Sort of what were the criteria that were particularly important for determining whether to include an indicator or not, any strengths and limitations, and then maybe to add on sort of Brad's point about where do you see that fitting into this actual getting a country to self-reliance, that narrative?
A small question.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, first we started with a really big hat. And we put all of it. Just kidding.
Sit up.
No. And I would say we followed a process that frankly is not too dissimilar for how MCC thinks about which indicators to choose when you're trying to look at the strengths and weaknesses of a particular data set. So this is necessarily a global exercise. So the first thing is this data set actually covering as much as possible, at the very least, every low and middle income country in the world, and ideally globally? That's very hard to find, and that automatically is going to eliminate a lot of data sets. That doesn't mean data sets that aren't globally covered we wouldn't look at potentially at a secondary or regional level. But when you're trying to get to this very, very high level, that's just a big piece. Then you want to look at the relevance of the concept we're trying to measure. You saw those subdimensions that I laid out there. And then very importantly, and Brad and Sarah and I live this at MCC in different forms, is what is actually underpinning these data? So what is the evidence, the integrity behind how these were put together, and to what degree are they actually actionable? I mean, we all lived and breathed this at MCC, which is the first thing a country is going to do is how do I Why have I been assessed this way, and what do I need to do to ideally try to improve or frankly even dispute it? So we need to make sure that it's more than just the guy in the room saying on a scale of 1 to 5, I give you a 4, right? And and there's no evidence behind that. That's not to say that some of these indicators do sort of suffer from that. Again, it's very hard to find these very robust indicators that have all of this, but we did want to try and find at least ones that were getting closer to that. And then lastly, we were looking for indicators that were at least regularly updated to the extent possible, and then are showing consistent results from year to year, which you don't want as wild swings either. So those, I think, would be the broad strokes of how we started to narrow down, and then speaking with a lot of experts on what is some of the new best-in-class thinking that's out there, looking at where MCC came from, some of the lessons learned that we had from that, and then really starting to narrow down to what, again, we feel is the best V1.0 for better or for worse.
Great. And then I just wanted to give you a minute to sort of say anything you want about this sort of supplementary data, because you mentioned in your presentation and then here, and obviously I imagine you don't have that all mapped out yet, but what kinds of things, whether it's the secondary sort of set of metrics you mentioned or more qualitative data, do you think will be important to sort of adding to those country dialogue and those conversations?
Yeah. So we've just began this process, and I think the key thing I'd say is we're not trying to create like some super roadmap that's going to be really, really detailed. I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is why and when do we need secondary analytics or secondary measures? We definitely need them, but what specific purposes do we need them for? Is it for a CDCS conversation? Is it for a bilateral dialogue conversation? Is it for a very narrow particular piece of the overall roadmap? We need to be very clear on where are the contexts where secondary analytics are going to matter. From that, we are then going to look at, I think, two things. What would be an approach to satisfy those needs? So is it going to our sectors and asking what sector, how the sectors are thinking about self-reliance? What are sector-level self-reliance indicators? What are the qualitative pieces of information you need to bring to bear? And so I could envision, again, if you're familiar with some at MCC, this concept of supplemental information is potentially coming up with something akin to a template or guidance or compendium of questions that you want to look at, indicators and qualitative information you want to look at for a particular task where the roadmap is your entry point, but you need much more detailed, potentially sectoral level, secondary level measures to show you the right quote unquote picture for the thing you're trying to solve.
All right, Sarah, I'm going to come back to you. So in recent years, there's been a push towards encouraging greater country ownership here, and I see a number of people in the room who I know have been a big part of that, and in part with recognition that it really is fundamental to achieving lasting development impact. You've written about country ownership and done some work on that. I'm curious how you would see these roadmaps sort of, and the journey to self-reliance approach maybe more broadly, fitting into that agenda.
I mean, it seems like there's a lot about the journey to self-reliance that really comports well with the idea that USAID has been, sort of more forcefully putting forth over the last couple of years about the focus on locally owned sustainable development, right? So as Susan pointed out in her opening remarks, this shifts in some ways the strategic focus to country-level kinds of issues rather than taking a broad sector kind of view, which USAID has previously put forth as sort of a primary lens at which to look at development issues. In the past, what we've ended up seeing is that, especially in terms of strategy setting kinds of conversations, it seemed that Washington-based tools and priorities have prevented to some degree from missions from entering into partner country dialogue, consultations, et cetera, with a clean slate, right? And so strategies ultimately end up reflecting to a certain extent, Washington-based influence in a lot of ways. And so I think there is room for this journey to self-reliance framework and the roadmaps also to enable that conversation to expand and be able to bring in different kinds of data that look at different kinds of things more broadly to be able to think about a conversation beyond just within a certain sector. So I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot to be said for how this does relate to a broader vision of country ownership. That said, I think a lot will depend on how the tool is ultimately used, and I think there's two levels to this. So one is, how does the roadmap tool and the secondary data, et cetera, interact with the various other Washington-based priorities, frameworks, strategies that also need to be brought to bear when developing a country strategy, for instance. What weight is it given? How does that look? And then the other question is, how does this tool work in terms of a partner country dialogue as part of the consultative process with a partner country when thinking about strategy setting, for instance? Are missions going to, use these indicators to try to, prioritize places based on what the indicators are suggesting? Or better, which is what it seems to be more the case of what USAID is putting forth, is it going to be a tool that can be, part of a conversation to sort of jointly hash out what priorities might be, thinking through important issues such as, sequencing, where other resources are coming to play, et cetera. So I think, the extent to which this becomes something more than, it's important to recognize this is a tool coming from Washington. So I think the extent to which it is not just another tool coming from Washington depends on how it is used and how it is used in sort of a joint fashion to be able to have a constructive conversation about what a strategy might look like. I think there's one other issue, and this relates to how countries might receive this assessment as well. So there's always an ideological component to any selection of indicators. Basically, if you select indicators, you are putting forth, this is what we think is important. And that's probably okay, right? It is the role of the US government in many respects to signal what it thinks is important, like liberal democracy, for instance. That is an important role that USAID has to play in the world. I also think there's probably a lot of pretty broad agreement about a lot of these indicators, especially a lot of the outcome indicators. I think no matter who you are, I think we all largely agree that child health and reducing the mortality of children under 5 is probably a good thing. I think some of the questions might come around, in fact, the roadmap language itself. The roadmap language adds an additional sort of normative layer of, and this is how you get to where you want to go. Which is not necessarily what a set of indicators is putting forth, but in part of a conversation with a partner country government, I think there needs to be sort of awareness and recognition going into it that there could be that kind of interpretation as well, and how that might be taken, and then how USAID might want to position itself in terms of that kind of response.
Great. Chris, I'm going to actually come back to you. So I think, many of the people, when these conversations first started, there was a lot of emphasis on this idea of sort of transition. We've really moved away from that, and I think your presentation made that really clear. You mentioned it's sort of talking about the development spectrum. But I think there's also an element of this that even if it's in dialogue with the country, that you would sort of imagine that this might change the equation at the country level, that it's trying to be a more strategic approach, which might change either the sector focus or the flavor of assistance provided in those contexts. I think many in here know that appropriators on Capitol Hill often play a pretty significant role in shaping the allocation of USAID's budget, and certainly administrations too have priorities that are not necessarily development that factor into how foreign aid is provided. So I'm wondering if you could just shed any light into the agency's thinking around how you sort of maneuver given some of those constraints.
Sure. So, and I think this is where it's important to draw a clear distinction between the MCC scorecard and what it does, and its very profound center at the MCC model, the red-green allocative nature of it, versus what this tool is going to be. This is going to be one tool of many that we feel helps us throw into relief a country's particular self-reliance profile. So what we would hope, I would think, is that as these evolve and are used over the coming years, is that they provide an objective touchstone, whether we're talking with our funders on the Hill, whether we're talking with the administration, the interagency, within our own buildings, certainly with our country governments and civil society. These are, in theory, objective indicators that show us a picture of self-reliance to begin a conversation on what the country actually needs, for lack of a better verb. And so I would hope that as a result of that, we can have the right conversations when there is mismatches in assistance or earmarks or whatever that might be. Whether or not that changes things, there are plenty of other factors that are going to be at play. Security concerns, foreign policy concerns, other stakeholder concerns. The roadmaps themselves are not perfect, but at least you're having that dialogue around something that is relatively objective and is a relatively common language that we can all speak from. So that's the goal. Whether or not we get there will remain to be seen, but this is one piece of that.
Fair. Okay, and Brad, I want to come back to you because you mentioned at the top this idea of a learning agenda, and I think that does seem like a really important element that I hope USAID is already thinking about, but maybe if you could add a little bit of additional detail, what kind of questions are important, how should they be moving ahead with this?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different ways that the learning agenda could go. I think in the spirit of the second point that I was making about keeping the main thing, I think it is important for us to know as an empirical matter whether improvements on these indicators correlate with reductions in aid dependence, right? I mean, if they're not, then saying that these commitment and capacity indicators are driving self-reliance is more questionable, right? So that is an empirical task. Someone needs to go and do that, and there are lots of different ways that you could do that. But I would not define that as the only objective of the learning agenda. I think one of the benefits that USAID has doing this now is having the benefit of hindsight, with MCC having been through something that's broadly analogous. And I can tell you that one of the things in the early days when the MCC was first starting this process of releasing country scorecards, they did not have a great system in place to systematically document how governments were responding to the assessments, right? And so that actually limited the ability to learn as the organization went along. And so I think it would be wise for USAID to put a system in place to document when a country comes in and they want to talk about their performance on the indicators, to have a way of understanding what are they interested in, where did the conversation go, how are they thinking about using this, and then once country officials start rolling up their sleeves and developing action plans, and this will happen, right? They're going to come up with plans of action for how they're going to try to improve their performance. One place where I think the learning agenda could help USAID quite a bit is to sort of classify the actions that are being taken according to whether or not we think they're going to advance the end goal. So I was involved in a study at the World Bank where we looked at the indicators that were selected within World Bank projects that were designed to improve institutional development, which is essentially about self-reliance, right? It's about having strong sort of domestic institutions that can discharge their core functions. And one of the things that we found was we sort of categorized the indicators that were selected based on whether they measured institutional form or institutional function. And this was profoundly relevant for the MCC, because what would happen is that countries would say, okay, my country didn't perform very well on the control of corruption indicator. What are the actionable things that I can do? I can pass anti-corruption legislation or revise it. I can stand up an anti-corruption commission. I can do these kind of de jure things that are within my control as a policymaker. Those are sort of measures of institutional form. What forms exist? Is there a law on the books? Is there an agency on the books? It does not tell us very much about the ability of those institutions to perform their functions and whether the laws are being implemented in practice, right? So in this study that we undertook, we actually had the benefit of being able to look at what the countries had selected as their indicators, and we saw a very peculiar pattern. The pattern was that the most aid-dependent countries, the actions that they prioritized were the form-based actions, and the countries that were least aid-dependent, i.e. most self-reliant, they picked the measures that had to do with institutional function, right? So that should be a little bit of a cautionary note, I think, for us that, if USAID is successful in sort of bringing these countries to the table to have a dialogue about self-reliance, we already have evidence that the most aid-dependent countries are going to be most inclined to pursue these more de jure, almost even cosmetic changes, and that's not what USAID wants, right? And so I think if USAID has a way of tracking what countries are doing, then it can sort of address these issues proactively.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so I do want to get questions from the audience, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds if anyone wants to raise like a final point. Sarah, did you want to?
I have one point that's not very intellectual, but sort of technically important too. I want to add to Brad's sort of learning agenda. And this is that I think it will be interesting for USAID to sort of take stock of what are the staff requirements to be able to implement this well. I think there's been a lot that's been said about the need to dive deep on some of these indicators. What does government effectiveness actually mean? What does liberal democracy actually mean? And so to be able to have a good policy dialogue or think about strategy setting in a particular way, there are going to be staff that are going to need to go down into these indicators to be able to understand exactly what they're saying, exactly how a country is being measured. And this probably isn't going to happen just every 5 years as part of a CDCS process. If these are being released every year, there are going to be demands coming from the partner country government about, what is this that we're talking about? And there are 17 different indicators for which there might need to be a deep dive undertaken. And so I think the question might be, sort of as this is implemented going forth, like what are the demands on staff time to be able to do this well? And what kind of resources might USAID need to seek to build up to be able to pursue it in a reasonable way?
Yeah, that's great. Brad, anything else that you wanted to throw in here?
No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think the other question is, where do these people sit? Yeah. Do they sit in Washington, or is it the USAID missions? Because the experience of the MCC was that the missions were getting lots of these queries themselves, and they weren't quite sure what to tell their counterparts. And so I think there is something to be said for there being people whose job it is, when they come into work on Monday morning, to do nothing but this to ensure consistency across countries and across time in the way that indicator performance is being unpacked and then shared in a diagnostic way with the counterpart countries. So that could be like, I don't know, a special purpose unit within USAID, but like a stable, predictable, institutional place where countries can go to engage in this dialogue. I think that will be important.
Chris, any words before we turn to the audience?
Let's go to the audience.
Great. So we're going to take questions. I'm going to suggest we take 3 at a time. We have mics in the back. Yeah, please raise your hand if you have a question. And then when the mic does come to you, if you could just say your name and affiliation, and we'll bring Susan back up on the stage here, so she can help us field questions, help the panel field questions. Okay, great. We're going to go Nora right here, this woman in the pink right here, and the gentleman in the suit right there, the first round. Yeah. In the middle, too. Well, one for each. Yeah, it's fine.
Hi, I'm Nora O'Connell with Save the Children, and I'm also the co-chair of the Accountability and Ownership Working Group for the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. So I have a comment and a question, and my comment is, Brad, I loved your point about let's not confuse indicators, which are an indication of something, with the thing itself. But I would add to the many cautions that I think were really important in this conversation, which is one of the cautions is actually I think USAID's been very careful not to define the problem as countries are dependent on aid. But I would say USAID's problem statement is closer to the fact that there are, more than 10% of the world's population that are living in less than $1.90 a day. So I think how we define the problem and us not making that extrapolation, I think, is really important, because I think USAID's been really thoughtful in that. And I really want to compliment the team at USAID who's been working on this. I think this is really exciting and a big step forward. My question is about country ownership. And I've been surprised by the lack of reference to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were a global, very, very driven by the G77. What does progress look like? Goal 16, indicator process, national action plans, the Common Africa Position, Africa 2063, all of this work that countries have been doing to lay out their own journey to self-reliance and to put this in sort of a global framework for cooperation. And I haven't really heard talk about how this agenda was actually consulted with our partner countries when we were developing these indicators, or how these global frameworks were referenced. And it's a little bit of a concern that it's been absent in the rhetoric, but I'm hoping there's a big untold story there. So I would love to hear more about that. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Laura Henneke with IntraHealth International, and my question actually follows Nora's very closely. Congratulations, a lot of work has been done. I think there's a lot of work to be done, as you've all shared. One concern is all of the global frameworks and strategies, and coming from World Health Assembly a couple weeks ago, that the US government is committed to, and that the countries have been involved in developing, and how that will fit into these new metrics. Another concern is actually probably more personal. I had the opportunity of working at a mission when MCC started, and it felt very chaotic. because as someone said, a lot of people were coming to the mission with a lot of questions. I was on the health team. We didn't feel like we had the answers to the questions. So I'm wondering, what is the plan for rolling this out at the USAID mission level? Will it be more staff at the missions? Will it be extensive training? How will ongoing programs change? We do have a lot of, 5-year, 7-year commitments out there. So kind of what's the rollout plan at the country level, specifically with USAID missions and their country counterparts? Thanks.
This gentleman right behind.
Thank you. I'm Bob Berg from the Stimson Center. Quick comment that the larger issue of having nuanced, carefully catered strategies is so important that we in the community here need to be able to defend that, because when John Bolton had the position Susan has now, the ink was hardly dry on an agreement, and he wanted to know what the results were of the program. So we'll have to defend a different timetable to make sure that you can be nuanced on this. I wanted to, I associate myself with the question about what do we expect other donors to do? Are we creating a void that other donors are going to fill, China, OECD? When I asked Administrator Green this last week, I think he ducked the question, but the Tidewater people who were there saying, yeah. So, but I wanted a new topic, are we preparing other parts of the U.S. government to step in and broaden and deepen relationships as we phase out?
Thanks. So that was a lot of questions, I feel like, in there. I feel like maybe a little bit more geared towards Susan and Chris. So if you guys want to jump in, I'm happy to run through some of what I heard too, but it seemed like you were also watching. So
Susan, maybe you wanted to take the SDG question. I can also talk a bit about the rollout.
Okay, great. This is not the first time that we've gotten that question. It's actually come up quite a bit, both in our internal consultations, and it was also discussed at Tidewater. I think we do not see any contradiction between the Journey to Self-Reliance and Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, as everybody understands, the Agenda 2030 is a broad, integrated agenda that the entire world has signed up to, but it also has this principle that each country decides for itself what are the most important parts of that agenda for that particular country. And the SDGs are their achievements that we all aspire to. But different countries are going to get to those achievements in different ways. And when we're, the metrics that we're looking at here about capacity and commitment, it's really about how it helps us to understand what are going to be a particular country's challenges in being able to achieve the SDGs that country has decided are important for it. And so I think it's not that we're presenting the Journey to Self-Reliance as some alternative narrative to the SDGs, but the SDGs are kind of an end state in some ways, and what we're talking about is what are the capacities and the kinds of policy choices, behaviors that countries need to make in order to get to the development objectives that they have. So to me, that's kind of the essence of country ownership, is that each country is defining for itself what its development objectives are, and then we're talking about how, what are the things that they need to be able to do to get there, and how do we support them.
We sort of add on to that as also, we're talking today about the metrics, but as you saw on that slide, there's a lot of other things we are doing as an agency around this idea of self-reliance. And certainly if we think about Goal 17 and its focus on partnerships, whether that's through financing self-reliance, private sector engagement, I think taking that front and center also is another example of how this is meant to complement the SDGs. It's not meant to be dissonant at all. If I could talk a little bit about rollout. this is going to be very hard. And I think we're quite cognizant of that. And I would say what you're seeing today, I can't underscore enough, we showed you the metrics. That's it. So we now have a lot of work to do to now translate those technically first into 140 roadmaps. That's going to take some time. We're now then going to have to start working very closely, and it's not start, we've begun this already, but working in lockstep with the State Department to figure out what is the right way to roll this out and sensitize our country counterparts to what this is and what this is not. And I think being really cognizant that we're not being seen as another MCC or another roadmap. I mean, that's going to be critical. We're working very closely on what this can look like. There's no way that anyone should be blindsided when we finally do put these roadmaps up on our Self-Reliance portal. That's my vision for what we're going to have. We're shooting for the fall to get there, but that's going to be a bit of a stake in the ground at this point because we do need to work very closely with our missions, with our embassies to make sure that we are talking about what this is and is not, and that everyone is on the same page of what this is not. And many things could, of course, happen through that process. So that's sort of what we're doing overall. To respond to Bob's question, on the other side of this piece is what about the rest of the US government? And I think particularly when we start thinking about the idea of strategic transitions, a lot of what those partnerships could look like may mean a smaller USAID footprint, but a bigger footprint for other pieces of the USG. So I think one of the big things that we're starting to work on, again, have already started to work on is, through the White House, through the interagency processes that the NSC drives, really getting more of an understanding across the interagency of what we mean by self-reliance, where it fits into the broader foreign policy framework, and then having that conversation, particularly as we start identifying our quote-unquote most self-reliant partners, how we ensure that as we define with our partner countries what a future state looks like, that we are not the only ones at the table that's there. I mean, some of you know the word legacy programming. We're trying to move away from that. That's why we're calling it strategic transition, because this is more than just the legacy of USAID. So.
Great, let's get another round. So we go here, this woman right here, and the woman right behind her.
Hi, Kevin Murphy from J. Austin Associates, and I speak from informed by having implemented over 600 development projects in about 127 countries over the last 32 years. The first observation is a political one. When you show up in a country and you're dealing with the Minister of International Cooperation, a Minister of Planning, people in the Ministry of Finance, it seems like you have a real political advantage here, because by the nature of what you're doing, you're saying this is uniquely empowering to the person you're working with. So they're not thinking of, okay, how does, USAID wants to get my okay so they can work around us and then do the things they really want to do. No, this is about you. The dialogue, it seems, completely changes, and I think that if the missions and the ambassadors and others are really aware that of what this can mean in terms of changing the dialogue with a country and really empowering the counterparts and honoring them, ennobling them, it seems to me that that's a really powerful, by its nature, political statement, which I'm sure you've been aware of, but it just seems like it really does. I mean, this is kind of a historic shift, because I've been involved in the dialogue with, the Minister of International Cooperation in Egypt, for example, and others, and all of a sudden it changes things. So I think that's really important. The second thing, just two quick observations for your comments, is that when you talk about improving the ability, if it were just about improving the ability to plan, finance, and implement, this would be projects to build public administration and public policy. You'd really be strengthening these ministries to do those three things, including mobilize a lot of private capital. Change laws, regulations, et cetera, Board of Investments, et cetera. But there's a lot of other things you want to do. So just the third observation, inclusiveness, for example. Inclusiveness is like, we want you to be able to run your own development show and achieve certain goals on your own, but we also want you to do this, and we also want you to do that, and we also think this is important. So, there's a little bit of a, it's not just about your ability to plan, finance, and implement your own development agenda. So I think we have to recognize that and not be hypocritical about it, saying, yeah, but to do X, Y, and Z because we think X, Y, and Z are important. So there is a what there, not just a capacity. And on the inclusiveness one, final observation, inclusiveness, the indicators that I saw, and I may not fully grasp what you've got there, are horizontal. Inclusiveness meaning women, minorities, or other special groups. But it seems to me that inclusiveness, the real challenge is horizontal, especially for those who've read Why Nations Failed or have been involved in countries that are either crony capitalism and rent-based versus more market-based. It's about, are the benefits going to a group at the top, or are they really diffused to the narrow middle band and to the lower band? So it doesn't seem like you've really caught the full grasp of inclusiveness when it's said, by the way, are you doing women and are you doing minorities, because we care about those. But are you really transferring the benefits of your economic policies to, all throughout, horizontally through the layers of your economy? Thanks very much, and great work, by the way.
Yes, Pauline Baker, the Fund for Peace. It seems to me that this is a very innovative framework for measuring government performance, and it's heavily data-driven. But my concern is that the ratings are all done by us. And we have, as pointed out, not only normative biases, but other biases in terms of the reliability of data, et cetera. How do you bring in, how do you bring in the perceptions of the people, not just NGOs, where you're talking about, the environment for NGOs, but how would the people rate these very indicators? It's not good enough just to have a dialogue with the government, because the government itself could be a driver against development if you have a predatory state. And related to that, how do you factor in other key political indicators where the data is very weak, such as political legitimacy, which is something that you need to probe the public perceptions about. So if you think, as a concrete example, a country like Egypt under Mubarak, how would this framework give you the insights to let you know that Mubarak could fall in 18 days?
Thank you. Cinnamon Dornseif, I'm on the faculty at Johns Hopkins SAIS, International Development. So thank you for hosting this very interesting and really great questions. My question is about the multilateral development banks and how closely you've been collaborating. You've been talking a lot about working with your missions, with the State Department, but the MDBs, the United States is either the largest, the co-largest, or a significant shareholder in those institutions. They have in place robust graduation policies, which seem to be very interrelated with what you are attempting to achieve, which is to increase self-reliance and the ability to work themselves out of reliance on development assistance or loans from the MDBs. So how much collaboration have you been doing with the MDBs? And not just about their graduation policies. I'm aware that that really focuses on economic growth, and some shareholders, including the United States, focused on pro-poor sustainable economic growth. Yours are more robust, but nevertheless, I see some synergies. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And again, I think these are a little more geared towards our USAID panelists, but Sarah and Brad, obviously feel free to jump in if you have insight from your experience at MCC or otherwise that you want to contribute.
Well, maybe I can start with the last one with respect to the multilateral development banks. I mean, I think to be quite frank, up until now we haven't had a lot of external discussion. Just because we've been so focused on getting to this point. However, there were some representatives of the multilateral development banks at Tidewater who participated in the conversation, and we recognize that it is really important for there to be some buy-in to this concept by other major development partners, because particularly at the country level, it's not going to be effective if the US is the only one talking to the government and to civil society and the private sector and saying, hey, we really think that, based on these indicators, you're going to have difficulty achieving your development objectives if you don't improve your private sector enabling environment. It's not going to be effective if we're the only ones saying that. We need to have other major development partners. We need to have the voice of the multilateral development banks in those conversations so that we as development partners are delivering consistent messages. And so I think that will be part of, as we go forward, as we socialize this approach. And I think that it will be important to have those conversations at the headquarters level, but I also believe it's really going to be important at the country level. We're going to be counting heavily on our mission directors to really help their colleagues to understand this new approach and to get them on board. So yeah.
If I can talk a little bit about sort of the question about inclusivity and also this very good comment about these readings are all done by us. I like that phrase. And I think it's also great also for Sarah and Brad to jump in also if we think about how we dealt with this at MCC. So I think this is a great example of how this tool is very different from an MCC scorecard. This is meant to be, and I don't mean this in a pedantic way, it is meant to be an entry point for many different types of conversations. It could be in a country development cooperation strategy context. It could be in a bilateral dialogue context on a particular issue. It's going to run the gamut. The MCC scorecard is used kind of for one thing and one thing only, which is trying to identify the world's best governed countries from a policy standpoint to make a particular allocation decision, right? So that's very different. So you have that competitiveness aspect, you have that percentile rank, and we can talk about distribution issues on the weirdness of that causes, like if I can just move up from the 49th to the 51st percentile, everything changes, right? That's not here, right? You don't see that on this. One of the reasons we took great pains to use what are called drip charts on those roadmaps where you see the distribution of all those countries is to throw that into relief, that you need to take an indicator with a particular grain of salt in terms of what it's actually showing you. So because of that, this is what I mean by these are indicators that allow us to be the entry point for a number of different conversations where then a whole other range of information can be brought to bear, a whole other range of conversations that pull together qualitative views of a particular issue can come to bear depending on the context of how it's being used. So if it's in dialogue with a country government on strategic choices in a CDCS, or if it's through a civil society consultation on a different piece, all of that can then speak to an issue that was highlighted either because it is consonant or dissonant with what is actually going on in the country itself. So again, a very different purpose, and one that again is just to sort of help you point where you want to go, but then lots of other information comes to bear for the actual decision or conversation being made.
Just a two-finger on that. I think that the flip side of this is if you put yourself in the shoes of the finance minister or the planning minister who's on the outside of this looking in, the thing about the MCC scorecards is there is a predictable venue in which a consequential decision is being made that's tethered to the metrics, right? And there are pitfalls associated with that, but it does have the effect of focusing the counterpart government officials' attention on a particular point in time. They know in October, November, the scorecards come out. This is when we have the dialogue, and decisions that matter to my country are going to be made related to these scorecards. So the roadmaps may be kind of a platform or a jumping off point for a lot of different types of decisions and a lot of different types of priority setting exercises. But if that is opaque to folks on the outside looking in, it's not necessarily going to give them that predictability to say there's an important decision that's being made. I want to be a part of this process. And that I do worry a little bit that could dampen interest. I mean, I think the worst possible outcome, right, would be if USAID expends all this effort to create the framework, staff up, inform the missions, et cetera, and then it sort of faces like a crisis of relevance, where people just don't pay attention to it because they don't understand how it's used in decision making. So I think that is where, as this kind of rolls out over time, being really clear, and it may be a country-specific conversation, I don't know, in the guidance that goes to missions, say this is how we intend to use this is when we intend to use it. I think that will be important if, Ambassador Green's in that kind of quote you started with, you said, we want to incentivize reform. That's one of the goals, right? I think to incentivize reform, you gotta create stable expectations of how these things are going to be used.
Can I just add on to that? I think one thing that host countries do care about are the mechanisms, the approaches that we use to deliver assistance. And we didn't focus on that today, but we talked about how as countries move along their development journey, as they gain more capacity to manage their own development, it's appropriate for us to be looking at different kinds of mechanisms to deliver assistance. And in particular, mechanisms that take advantage of country capacity, that build country capacity. And we know that many of our partner countries are interested in having more assistance that moves through local systems. And so I think that is one thing that will flow from this conversation, and that certainly that's a decision that will flow from this around the kinds of the approaches that we're using to deliver assistance.
Great. Well, I think we can fit in one more round if it's really quick. So keep your comments brief. Didier, someone back here, and Andrea, right here.
Great. Congratulations to USAID for undertaking such a thoughtful exercise on DDA-TRIN with MFAN. My question has to do with the role of Congress. On the subject of roadmaps, how much of these indicators have been road tested with the Hill? I think for me there could be a danger of Congress embracing these metrics too much, given the success of the MCC. I think the reason MCC enjoys bipartisan support is because it does have an emphasis on rigorous metrics. And my concern in the long term is that there could be a push from the Hill to move these metrics towards being more determinative, as you said, instead of informative. And frankly, given the potential inclination of Congress to graduate countries too quickly off assistance.
My name is Jerry Hush, and I'm actually going to take the perspective of the person sitting at the desk in the country. I've worked for the last 30 years in multinational settings, across UNDP, WHO, FAO, other organizations that are ostensibly seeking to do the same thing. We've heard about capacity building for I don't know how many years. My concern is that I work with people on the ground who actually fill in the forms related to all of these indicators. And I know you responded to the SDGs, but I really am concerned that you're not taking into consideration the reality on the ground, not only in the statistical offices, but across the various ministries, the burden that is viewed when the US goes into a country and has yet another list of indicators that these countries have to adhere to. I'm very concerned about this, because I've worked on country national plans, NAPAs, NAPs, you name it. Everybody's talking about having the appropriate indicators so we can do our strategic planning. This is not new. And I'm very concerned, because I go to countries where people go, oh my God, the US is going to do it again. People have told me they are just not going to accept US assistance. The burden of reporting is enormous. And the burden of reporting associated with the SDGs has to be taken into consideration. I must admit, I'm totally astounded that the SDGs were not part of this conversation at a much, much deeper level.
Okay, we got one more over here on the far side. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Andrea Hayes-Birchler. I'm an independent consultant working largely in aid effectiveness and evaluation. Brad talked a lot about incentive effects and incentivizing, and within the MCC context, I think there's this very clear sense of, with MCC, the scorecard attempts to incentivize certain policy reforms, and the incentive is that at the end you get recognition for being a well-governed country and money. You get grants. Whereas Brad's already mentioned one concern about incentivizing here, which is if that the use of the roadmap is opaque, then is there any incentive at all? But even beyond that, I would be concerned that if the incentive is we downgrade your mission and turn your grants into loans, then is that in fact a incentive that countries are going to respond to in a favorable way?
weigh in on, I think.
Sure. I can address a couple
your
of things.
opinion is first. I think that would be interesting.
No, I mean, I think the risk of sort of perverse incentives, either for underperformance or undermeasurement, is always there, I think, with something like this. I think in some ways you have to sort of take into account sort of what a political economy looks like, because within a particular country you're going to have stakeholders that are more interested in maintaining access to certain amounts of funding. There are also stakeholders who are interested in the certain sort of change in cachet, or whatever, for lack of a better word, that comes with being able to demonstrate higher performance. And so I think being able to understand sort of how those dynamics work within different stakeholders in a country is going to be important for how this conversation will end up looking. But I think any conversation does need to be sensitive to that sort of that question, right? Is that if this is an issue? I think having sort of broad-based indicators that are fairly opaque and not very actionable in some ways reduces the perverse incentive kind of situation, because it is hard to very specifically be able to move the needle in very concrete ways to change performance on some of these indicators in a positive way, and that's also true for a negative way as well. I wanted to harken back to a couple of quick questions that were mentioned before, and one is the question about how do you bring in perspectives of people, how do you bring in inclusivity? I think these are very important questions that go way beyond the journey to self-reliance conversation that we're having right now. These are questions that should involve everything to do with strategy setting in the US government, project design, et cetera. This is something that that USAID tried to seek to bring to bear in a greater way, and its sort of policy revisions that it did, a year ago. So I think it's important to have this conversation as part of the journey to self-reliance, but it is also separate and greater than that as well. And I'll.
Brad, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just quickly, the gentleman who asked the question about politics, I want to sort of try to answer that question as well as address Andrea's question. So I've been, for basically 7 years, studying this question of what happens when you have these external metrics and how do governments respond to it. And just a couple stylized empirical facts have emerged that I think are important to internalize. The first one is that if you look at the 42 or 43 countries that took the MCC process seriously, appointed a technocratic team to diagnose performance, think about measures that could be taken, they are disproportionately democracies. Point one. Point two is that within countries, the individuals who are kind of most sympathetic to these types of exercises tend to be Western educated, Western socialized technocrats. Some of them used to work for the MDBs and now they're working in a finance ministry. I think of these folks as the sympathetic interlocutors. These are the folks in the democracies and the Western trained and socialized technocrats that are sort of least likely to go down the path of trying to game the system. What we also know from research is that highly aid-dependent countries are countries that often try to game the system. So I think that through doing these kind of cosmetic changes or form-based changes that aren't meaningful, and they're very narrowly targeted, not on the main thing, but on trying to move the indicator needle. So this harkens back to why this learning agenda at USAID is so important, really understanding the dynamics that are set in motion once these, keep wanting to say scorecards, once the roadmaps are released, and then you start to see these country responses.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to respond to at least the first two questions on Congress, and then also just going back to the SDG question. So Congress has been closely involved with this whole process since the very beginning. So we've been consulting with all the four main committees, certainly that look at this on both the House and the Senate side. So they are not surprised by this effort. They certainly gave their input into some of our indicator choices. So again, they've been very closely looped up. I think what I have taken away from these conversations is that they're excited that we're addressing some of the opacity in the decision making, and that this is giving a bit of a transparent rubric that we can all sort of speak from. Now, whether that then leads to some overzealous use of these indicators, I don't know. But this is something that, certainly these are the same committees that deal with MCC, and a lot of their criticisms, and there are plenty on the scorecard, as much as they love the scorecard, they also will understand in this context as well. So hopefully, again, it's going to be more of a dialogue tool as opposed to prescriptive tool, but we will see. It is certainly an issue that's out there. Just going back to the SDG point, I just want to underscore that there should be zero reporting burden requirement on this. These are all third-party indicators that have been collected for, in many cases, years by these indicator institutions. So the indicator institutions are the ones doing it. It's not the countries or our missions or anything like that. This is going to be just like the MCC scorecard indicators that anyone can find on the web that are regularly produced. So from a reporting burden standpoint, that should be minimal. And as I just going back to the broader SDG point is, again, I think we very much see this as a complement to, not in competition of, the SDGs. If there's anything you wanted to add to that, Susan.
Well, maybe I wanted to follow up on a couple things that came up during the panel. First of all, I really appreciated the comment, and I think it came up in some of the questions too, around the importance of having staff who are going to be able to help both in our missions in the interagency and also with our host country partners to talk about these indicators and help them understand them and how do we change them and whatnot. And that is a conversation that we are actively involved in right now. But it's absolutely, we will not be able to, and we are going to have a small self-reliance metrics unit that will be established initially in PPL and then in the new Policy Resources and Performance Bureau. However, that will absolutely not be sufficient. We will need to have a network of experts across the agency, both in the various sectors in Washington, as well as some people in the field in missions who have expertise in these areas. So, but it's a very real challenge, and we really only just began to grapple with it. So, if you have any suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. And I was also thrilled to hear you say recommend a learning agenda, because in fact we have already started to build a learning agenda around this. I think we do recognize that it's important. I mean, we have a hypothesis here, right? Around that capacity and commitment, and as defined by these indicators, is going to lead to countries being more self-reliant, and that is an hypothesis, and we need to test that. And so we are in the process right now of starting to do that along with the rest of this. So so thank you for endorsing that approach.
Great. Well, thanks so much. So we ran a few minutes over, which is my fault, but let's give a big round of applause to the panel here, and to Susan and Chris. Good job. And thanks so much for being a great audience.
Congratulations.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, it was a lot of hard work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.